Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second part of this series covering the LDS Truth Claim series featuring Brett McDonald. In our last episode, we did an introduction to the series and we talked a little bit about epistemology. This episode, we'll be going over the informal witnesses to the golden plates. One little additional note that comes up at the beginning of this episode of LDS Truth Claims, and so is worth reviewing here, is that Brett McDonald has introduced something of an epistemology for this series, which he calls the reasonableness standard. Essentially, is it reasonable to believe in the claims being made based off of the evidence that's available? It's something that appears to be less than a preponderance standard, so less than better than 50% evidence in favor, and it just needs to be reasonable. This is a pretty fluid epistemology that doesn't appear to actually have much grounding. It states that as long as the belief is, at least to the person trying to assess the claim, reasonable, then it's worth believing in. I don't know what claim we could possibly actually falsify based off of that epistemic standard, and that's largely my problem with it. So it'd be pretty hard to actually assess the truth value of the claims being made according to that epistemic standard. We'll go ahead and take a look at a similar claim to miracles and assess just how well can that actually be understood according to the reasonableness standard. And we'll look at what might be some better ways potentially to assess our epistemology, and really whether or not witness statements at all can help us to meet the burden of proof for claims such as golden plates and those associated with LDS truth claims. So on the 13th of October in 1917, over 70,000 people gathered to witness the manifestation of Virgin Mary in Fatima, Portugal. And witnesses there reported something truly miraculous. According to them, the sun began to dance in the sky. It zigged and it zagged about, and that manifested somehow the presence of the Holy Virgin. The entire spectacle was said to last at about 10 minutes. We have a mass hallucination or a mass witnessing of some sort of miracle that lasts for about 10 minutes. You may believe that this miraculous occurrence transpired as it was described by those witnesses, and that the interpretation that those witnesses gave is in fact accurate, that this was a true manifestation of the power of the Virgin Mary. You may think that there's something else going on with this story. And that's the thing about witnesses. They are not always reliable. People can misremember. They can forget things. They can lie. They can believe things happened which never actually happened. And they can be deceived into thinking that certain things happened, whether or not those things actually occurred. Witnesses are fallible. And ideally, when making the case for a claim, especially a larger claim, we would have more than just witness testimony. Let's take a look at actually a relatively minor claim. If I were to tell you that I owned a red Ferrari, decently sized claim, right? If I were to make that claim, it may be helpful if I were to get some of my friends and family and associates to tell you about that, to tell you about seeing me with my red Ferrari, that I had purchased it, that I owned it. That may be helpful. But it might be even more convincing to you if I were to get my most bitter enemy, my sworn nemesis, to be able to tell you that I did, in fact, own a red Ferrari. Hostile testimony is maybe a little bit more convincing, right? But better still, what if I could give you pictures of my Ferrari parked in front of my house, or with me in the driver's seat? Now, with the advent of modern technology, you might note that even with a picture, we can falsify that. We can Photoshop me sitting in the front of the car, right? We could falsify or Photoshop putting in a red Ferrari in front of my house. So maybe that doesn't work. Maybe what would be even better is if I were to show you the receipt with the VIN number, and you could actually look up that VIN and make sure that it aligns with a red Ferrari. As you can see, like, we get beyond witness testimony, especially that of friends and family and associates, friendly witnesses, pretty quickly. Hostile witness is really good, right? That's much, much better. But there are even better standards of evidence that we can go with. And that's for a relatively mundane claim about a red Ferrari. The thing is, red Ferraris exist. You can go to a dealership that trades in luxury cars. You can see one for yourself. I actually, while I was doing this, the research for this, I learned that there is actually a name for the particular red that is Ferrari red. That should actually probably make it pretty clear that I don't actually own a red Ferrari, that if I were to make that claim, it would be a false claim. Um, and it's kind of funny how just one of those like little falsifying facts like that, where can kind of pretty quickly knock down this like more audacious claim, right? So if I have this non-audacious standard of I don't own a red Ferrari, and I make the admission that I didn't know that there was a special term for Ferrari red, pretty easy to knock down the more audacious claim. After all, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So we lack evidence for golden codices in the ancient world, unlike red Ferraris. And that is including and especially in the pre-Columbian New World. We lack evidence of any Semitic migration to the pre-Columbian New World, and we lack any evidence of languages such as Hebrew or Egyptian, even in their reformed forms, in the pre-Columbian New World. Despite all of this, Brett McDonald and many other apologists and believers in Mormonism express the view that witness testimonies, such as the 3 witnesses, the 8 witnesses, and in this video, we'll be talking about the informal witnesses, provide a very substantial and significant and important piece of evidence for the existence of golden plates, and that this is somehow a significant challenge for critics who would seek to basically say that they're not convinced, and perhaps for those critics who are trying to establish a naturalistic model. This claim is of, I would say, a much more extraordinary level than the claim that I own a red Ferrari. And yet, honestly, what McDonald and other apologists do is they are operating off of evidence that is much, much lower, honestly, than even the lowest form of what we thought might be acceptable for the red Ferrari claim. And that this is somehow supposed to be difficult for critics. If we were to use McDonald's standard, the reasonableness standard, and apply that to the miracle of the sun that we talked about earlier, when the sun danced about the sky in Fatima, Portugal, I wonder how he could possibly refute that. I wonder how he could possibly say that those events did not occur as the witnesses described it, with the meaning to it, with the interpretation to it that the witnesses gave to it. Fact is that witness testimonies, though an interesting complication, if you're trying to make a positive case for Book of Mormon naturalism, is barely a bump in the road for providing a negative case against Book of Mormon supernaturalism. Taken entirely at his word and without any additional historical criticism, where do McDonald's claims about the witnesses actually get us? If somewhere in the ballpark of 22 people claiming to have some experiences connected to the plates with no provenance or evidentiary backing to suggest that the underlying claims of witnesses is even possible, meaning that we don't even have evidence that extenuating evidence that would suggest that what the witnesses claimed to have seen could even possibly have existed. And this is honestly not terribly unlike the many witnesses who claimed to see the sun dance in the sky on that October day in 1917 Portugal. So McDonald begins his discussion with the so-called informal witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He divides them into 2 broad camps. He has the natural informal witnesses and the supernatural informal witnesses. Natural witnesses would claim to have had a physical interaction with the plates. They would claim to have touched the leaves of the plates or those sorts of things. Supernatural witnesses may have had those types of physical encounters with the plates, but really what distinguishes them is that they had some kind of encounter with an angel, or some sort of visionary type experiences. And what McDonald is going to argue is that the hallucinatory, that if we were to try to argue hallucinations or hallucinatory experiences, that this would not account for the claims of these witnesses. And maybe McDonald has seen the sun dance the same way that those witnesses to the miracle of the sun did. So let's take a look actually at McDonald's argument with respect to the informal witnesses and treat it as fairly as we possibly can. See here that we have basically 4 main premises, or three premises and a conclusion, with a corollary added to premise B. In premise A, we state that we have documents for at least 14 cases of informal witnesses claiming that they felt plates weighing between 40 and 60 pounds. They lifted the plates, or that they were shown by angels. That's doing a lot of heavy lifting and talking about the diversity of what the witnesses are actually claiming and the specificity of what the witnesses are claiming. Few, if any, witnesses claim all of these factors. Premise B, it is improbable that Joseph Smith rendered these people incompetent by making them see visions because, corollary A, many occurred without Joseph present, and corollary B, there is no reasonable argument for how Joseph kept a large group of people in vision for 1.5 years since the plates were around and lifted for that period of time. We'll discuss that further. C, premise C. Many non-converts and non-friends tried to steal or bargain for the plates. And conclusion, D. Therefore, it is reasonable, probable, that Joseph Smith in fact possessed plates weighing between 40 to 60 pounds, as he claimed. This is argument number one. There are a number of problems with this argument. First, the grammar of A is imprecise as to make unclear what is actually being claimed. A is generally non-offensive, not terribly controversial. We do, in fact, have these documented cases. What we need to do is actually examine these claims as to how strong they are and how much they actually substantiate the claim being made. So how many witnesses did each one of these things in terms of lifting the plates, feeling them, seeing an angel? Did they lift it? How did they lift them? And were the plates basically uncovered, or did they lift those plates while they were under a cloth or in a box? And what of those who were shown the plates by angels? How can we corroborate that claim? We now have to actually, in addition to having this existence of these plates, this golden codex that comes from the pre-Columbian New World, we now have to deal with the question of the reality of angels or multiplying entities, which is a bit of a violation of Occam's razor. And also, we need to substantiate in this case that angels have the ability, or the lack thereof, to show plates to people. When we get into B, we do have these two corollaries, and I do want to make a bit of an objection to the use of the word making, as though the argument is from critics is that Joseph compelled or forced the witnesses to have visions, rather than the more likely and more modest claim that he caused visionary hallucinations in at least some circumstances with those who are already predisposed to such, not through force or coercion, but through charisma. The first corollary here points out that many experiences among the 14, though a specific number is not actually cited in that first corollary, occurred with no Joseph Smith present in the room, as it were. And honestly, I think that we can actually grant that there were some of these visions that were, or these claimed visions, that were had without Joseph Smith around. And the issue that I have with B is that with the second corollary in B is that it operates under the implicit argument that Joseph Smith must have maintained this visionary state among these witnesses for about 18 months. Weirdly, this is predicated on the idea that the plates were around and lifted for that period of time. But this is another example of a lack of precision in language that McDonald is using. The plates, most certainly under any account that we have, were not constantly lifted around and lifted for that period of time. Faithful accounts often have the plates hidden. McDonald even refers to these situations in which the plates were supposed to have been hidden, which nobody would have seen them. And even when the plates were supposed to have been around, visibility of the plates is often reported to have been obscured, hidden under a cloth or within a box. Even in granting the most favorable interpretation of premise B, the option that Joseph regularly served spiked wine, or in other ways may have actually compelled visions when people were around, is entirely plausible, though I would not try to make that argument, as I don't think there's any actual evidence within the record. But it is a naturalistic possibility that we would have to rule out before we start accepting supernatural ones. If Joseph was in the sort of habit of giving spiked wine to those of his associates he was trying to convince of supernatural occurrences, then maintaining visions, as it were, whenever the plates were around would have been perhaps almost trivial. And even without that point, premise B does fail to account for other ways in which witnesses could be in error. Many witnesses may have already felt the desire, the need, or the impression to receive a vision, to have an experience. Many existed in a magical worldview in which they would have already been predisposed to those sorts of reports and claims. Premise C ultimately has nothing to do with the argument being made. Whether or not non-friends tried to steal the plates from Joseph is irrelevant to whether or not there were actually plates at all. This is a red herring. And while herrings may be useful for chopping down the mightiest tree in the forest, they are much less so for establishing the reliability of the informal witnesses. At best, this claim could be used to suggest that some people were led to believe that Joseph Smith was in possession of plates, but it does nothing to establish the reality of the same. Premise C could be part of another syllogism that is meant to establish the reality of the plates, but in this particular syllogism, as constructed by McDonald, this is just a distraction and nothing more. There is no suggestion in this argument that the individuals referred to in premise C had any knowledge whatsoever of actual extant plates. And when you go into McDonald's actual arguments and see that, all you see is that there were people who may have believed that Joseph had plates. Finally, we get to the conclusion. And the conclusion itself should follow from the premises as stated. This isn't the case. The conclusion injects a new premise, that of Joseph claiming himself that he possessed 40 to 60 pounds of plates. And the argument does not address the probability of witnesses accurately reporting the existence of and experience with actual plates. The argument does not account for the probability or reasonableness of angelic manifestation, and the argument includes a logical fallacy in the form of a red herring. When you sit in a logic class, you are taught that a good argument is both valid and sound. And for an argument to be valid, the conclusion must follow from the premises. For an argument to be sound, it has to be valid, and the premises must be true. A sound argument is also absent any formal or informal logical fallacies. This argument does not meet the standards of being either sound or valid. From the first argument, McDonald presents a second, one that he considers a reductio ad absurdum. I believe that as he goes forward, he calls it the argument from absurdity. And it reads as such. In premise A, Joseph Smith is either a fraud or he got the plates as described. Premise B, if Joseph Smith is a fraud, the following people must be co-conspirators or dupes. And you can see this long list of co-conspirators or those who were in some way duped into having experiences with the plates. Premise C, since all translation witnesses record dictation without the use of any materials, any witnesses that also had a view of the translation must also be co-conspirators. Premise D, the only current hypothesis, and this coming from Brody and Vogel, and I wonder if after the 7 or 8 years since this series, if McDonald would claim that there are other critical hypotheses at present. The only current hypothesis makes no attempt to prove conspiracy. Premise E, therefore, if Joseph Smith is a fraud, he has to, corollary I, create an extensive metallurgical fraud, this to dupe the 22 natural witnesses, as well as, corollary 2, corollary double I, induce mass at least 10 people, hallucination that extends months, and this would have to go all throughout the dictation of the Book of Mormon, and into places where he was not present, and in some cases for people he had not met. Premise F, it is highly improbable that Joseph Smith could have accomplished C. I took this down exactly as McDonald had it written. I now most likely understand this, if I were to correct this, to read B through E. Premise G, therefore, or rather, not premise G, but the conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable, probable, that Joseph Smith possessed plates, as he claimed. This is argument 2. And credit where credit is due. McDonald does appear to have, at least at first blush, produced a valid argument. The conclusion does appear to follow from the premises. And we can discuss whether or not this argument is actually valid once we actually go through the analysis. But at first blush, this does appear to be a valid argument. In premise A, McDonald argues that Joseph Smith is either a fraud or that he had the plates as he claimed. When looking at the soundness of an argument, premises that are structured as either or should be a bit of a red flag. It is rather likely that in these situations, there's a logical fallacy known as a false dichotomy or an either-or fallacy present. And we might be able to imagine a situation in which Joseph Smith was not a fraud, but his story about the plates was not entirely true. And this really depends on what your definition of fraud would be. And so is it within the realm of even our imagined possibility that there were some adolescent aliens who wanted to play a prank in 19th century New England, saw this young Joseph, gave him a golden codex, and all that this was just a laugh for them? That Joseph was sincere and honest in all that he was doing, but that he himself was duped. Does that make Joseph a fraud in that case? He also may have actually possessed plates within that particular circumstance, but it would also not be the things that Joseph claimed it to be. And we can see that this is a particular scenario in which this could arise, and we have a fallacious false dichotomy within premise A. Within premise B, we have another fallacy in this situation. We have something of an implied conclusion that's been brought into the argument at this point that has not yet been established. So this is the idea that the only way for Joseph to have achieved his fraud is through this dichotomy of either having co-conspirators or invoking hallucinations, rather than something more nuanced and developed. There's also the use of this word dupe, and I find it to be imprecise. I don't know what is actually intended by duping. We can intuit a meaning for the term with the references in the corollaries that have to do with the hallucination, and then again in premise E to both hallucinations and to a metallurgic fraud. And I suppose then, if we were to go with that a dupe is one who has been subjected to either hallucination or the metallurgic fraud, and who was not necessarily involved in the process of conveying false information. Though this lack of clarity is ultimately up to McDonald to rectify, to actually give us some clarity. And lacking such clarification, it's hard for me to actually engage with the truthfulness of premise B overall. The corollaries to premise B provide their own bit of entertainment, of course, as they multiply several entities in violation, as we've already seen, to the Occam's razor principle. And I would argue that Occam's razor is probably the tool that you want to use if you're trying to argue for a reasonableness standard for epistemology. For one, Joseph Smith is listed as a co-conspirator in his own conspiracy. If Joseph had entirely acted alone, I wonder if that would mean then that he had been conspiring with himself. Rather, this appears to be padding the information that's available, and I have to wonder why this is being done. Regardless, the three witnesses are included as witnesses to the plates, the Liahona, the spectacles, the sword of Laban. So now, in addition to dealing with the plates and to the angel and all of that, we also have to deal with the sword of Laban. We have to deal with the director. We have to deal with the spectacles. And all the reasonable standard now has to deal with all of these other artifacts, all of which lack provenance and a context in which they would fit in. Next, witnesses to a full view of the plates are cited. These include the 8 witnesses and a handful of informal witnesses who also claim to see an angel. As noted with the previous argument, the reasonableness of angels and their ability to manifest plates is in no way, shape, or form established. And ultimately, this is like with the sun dancing through the sky. It is more likely that a person claiming to have seen an angel is reporting a hallucinatory experience than not, even if it's a group of them. Joseph's level of involvement in the formation of these hallucinatory experiences is frankly immaterial at this point. Lucy Smith, it further adds in an additional complication because she's going to talk about the Nephite breastplate. And this is yet another artifact for which provenance is lacking. We then have informal witnesses who lifted the plates or felt the plates or who saw them covered. And I don't know why this is done, but McDonald highlights that William Smith was 16 years old at the time. Is this meant to establish William's reliability due to the famous reliability of 16-year-olds? I don't know. What this does highlight is just how I find unscrupulous apologists can get. And you can see right here where Lucy Harris is listed, Lucy Harris and the daughter. Lucy Harris is not even allowed to speak for herself on this matter. Her witness is attributed to Martin Harris and Lucy Mack Smith. But hey, if it adds one more name to the list, right? As with the previous argument, what do these people actually experience? What is actually being claimed here? As plates are covered in these cases, in this case, all these witnesses may be able to attest to is the presence of a mass of some kind, perhaps weighing between 40 to 60 pounds. We move on to premise C, where we face yet another red herring. Remember, this is about establishing the existence of plates through the witness testimonies. We're trying to use witness testimonies, the informal witnesses, to establish that Joseph Smith had plates 40 to 60 pounds. So whatever happens in the dictation process of the Book of Mormon is honestly immaterial to whether or not somebody saw plates. It is worth looking at this point overall in this debate about LDS truth claims. I will grant that if we were talking about the dictation process of the Book of Mormon, this is an important point. But the point here being associated with the plates, it seems to be arguing that if they were involved in the dictation, they had to be a co-conspirator with the plates, because they saw no other materials. And I don't understand that. All that they would have seen is that Joseph is dictating words. And since these are all scribes that are being talked about, these are people who are writing down the words that Joseph was talking about. Joseph went about that particular dictation. There were times it seems that the plates were not even in the room, whether or not there actually were plates. And this just appears to be part of the narrative, regardless of if you're taking a faithful claim or a critical position. Yeah, so at this point in time, with the list that we have, it seems like a lot of what's being listed here is just rhetoric that's meant to make the idea of conspiracy seem too grand and too unmanageable, rather than actually dealing with the possibility that there may have been a conspiracy. I don't argue that there is a conspiracy. I like Vogel or Brody. I'm not really interested in that. But that doesn't mean that premise D actually holds up. You see, neither Vogel nor Brody argue for conspiracy, according to McDonald, and this is supposed to act as some kind of way of saying that the only remaining critical or naturalistic explanation is that there was some kind of hallucination fraud campaign going on. And I would contend that this is not the only explanation, but this is what McDonald is going to do. McDonald implies that once we consider premise E, that if there are no critics arguing for conspiracy, then there must not have been one. And that was ultimately regardless of what may happen in the future with certain critical arguments that may develop. This is why I wonder what may be McDonald's position today in light of new arguments and new information. And I hope that the implied argument here that this is clear why this is absurd. McDonald is arguing a positive case. If a lack of a conspiracy is somehow necessary to establishing the veracity of his conclusion, then he has the obligation to establish the lack of conspiracy. Critical silence on this point can only be used as an interesting note or piece of evidence, but not ultimately something that actually concretely establishes as fact that there was no conspiracy. I do not believe that McDonald should have to prove the lack of conspiracy in order to establish the correctness of his conclusion, but this is the argument that he has formulated. Premise D ultimately appears to be yet another red herring. It doesn't actually help us to get to the conclusion. The purpose of D does seem to be to eliminate the idea of a conspiracy, but it's irrelevant to the matter at hand, because whether or not there are critical arguments available to support a conspiracy does not establish whether or not there was a conspiracy or whether or not there were plates. In premise E, we finally start talking about the dupes, I suppose. Again, this is not clear. We have two corollaries in this case. And in the first corollary, we actually get to something a little bit new here, and that is this idea of the extensive metallurgical fraud. And we have to wonder if this extensive metallurgical fraud would even be necessary. McDonald appears to think so. I am not yet convinced of this. I know that many apologists have argued that there had to have been, or there is a case to make, even that there had to have been some kind of artifact available. There may have been an artifact. I think that there is a chance that there was some physical object which stood in the place of plates if it was not plates itself. But why is a metallurgical fraud in that case needed as opposed to any other sort of fraud? And we also have to wonder, like, what is the role of the unreliability of memory and witness testimony play in all of this? As Steve Pinecker has put in his discussions with Mormonism with the Murph about golden plates, when talking about the golden plates found in Saudi Arabia, if 21st century saints can be fooled by fake plates, what does that say about 19th century saints? McDonald ultimately doesn't really appear interested in this. And granted, some of these issues came up much later, but some of these issues were present before. He doesn't appear to be interested in that, at least not in the way that he's constructed this argument. Ultimately, if we were to give the first corollary here to premise E any sort of weight, we need these issues addressed. And there have been attempts to actually establish the plausibility that Joseph could have created a metallurgical fraud. I'm not sure how much credibility it lends to that possibility. I'm open to it, but it does appear that using 19th century tools and resources that may have been available to Joseph Smith, it would be entirely possible to create a false set of plates. Premise F contends that it is most likely that Joseph could not have done what is listed in premise C. I am assuming that this is just a mere typo. As I stated before, I'm pretty sure that this is actually going to be talking about B through E. And so, yeah, we're going to go ahead and kind of run with it that way. So what's the probability of Joseph making some sort of physical deception as well as inducing the sorts of experiences required to deceive at least 10 people over the length of time required? Well, maybe not as far out of reach as McDonald wants it to be. McDonald is honestly there doesn't appear to be too interested in doing anything more than making a mere assertion. A Mormon Stories listener has produced a facsimile of plates using materials that would be available in the 19th century context, and that suggests that the first corollary in premise E is feasible. Maybe not probable, but feasible. And broadening the scope of the definition of extensive metallurgical fraud such that it doesn't actually have to be made out of metal further increases this feasibility, because then other materials could actually be used, or just putting something heavy in a box. Something vaguely rectangular underneath a cloth when the plates are supposed to be covered by a cloth can now serve that particular function. And it's worth mentioning that the way that McDonald has constructed the second part is frankly absurd. Even if hallucinations were required on an individual basis, the time extension is just not needed. Nobody needed to be deceived constantly for 18 months. Nobody saw the plates that long. The plates were not under observation for that amount of time. There are very short windows of time in which anybody's reporting to even see or handle the plates. And once we start considering those shorter windows of time, it becomes pretty much like when the sun danced in the sky in Fatima, Portugal. So what do we do with our conclusion? Well, in light of the fallacies in McDonald's argument, we are right to reject the conclusion, at least at present. McDonald presents a false dichotomy in premise A, and so the conclusion G already does not follow logically. In B and C, we see we're seeking to establish the scope of the overall problem, but in so doing, we start multiplying the entities involved in trying to make this positive claim work. This is going to act against the reasonableness standard. And it doesn't even actually make the points that McDonald wants to make. It doesn't lead to the point that McDonald wants to make. And so we have a red herring in premise C. With premise D, we're going to, McDonald tries to eliminate at least one possible contradiction to the conclusion G, but he fails to establish that there is a way of eliminating that. The way that he argues it is just by saying that critics aren't arguing for that position, but that doesn't eliminate the possibility. And then in E and F, he tries to ultimately deal with the fraud counter and all the other premises as a whole. And we largely just end up with what we had in the first argument. We just address those same points again. And this time we add a physical component to this whole equation of the extensive metallurgical fraud that now has to be accounted for or not, depending on what claim you're actually trying to argue for. But McDonald doesn't really account for additional alternatives to E. And so premise F can't do what it needs to do, where premise F needs to eliminate all other possible counter options except for the idea that Joseph had plates as he claimed in order for the conclusion to follow, because there are so many other counter possibilities that may be brought up. F fails in what it attempts to do, and the conclusion does not follow. And with that, we end his presentation on the informal witnesses. In summary, McDonald presents two unsound arguments, both of which I contend are also invalid. In terms of presenting a positive case for LDS truth claims, even under a reasonableness standard, McDonald is not off to the strongest of starts. The arguments made from informal witnesses just don't meaningfully move the needle in supporting the positive claim. And we are less justified, I would contend, in accepting their claims than we are of accepting the claims of those who saw the sun dance in Fatima in October of 1917. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you in part 3 when we start getting into the 3 witnesses. See you then.